Welcome everyone to tonight's event, Imposter Syndrome, what it is and how to overcome it. We're really delighted that you're all able to join us. This event is the fourth in a series that Dr. Carla, Marquez-Lewis and I have been organizing called the First Generation Student Success Series. The first event, which happened last fall, was about navigating academia and higher education for first-gen students and focused on kind of demystifying some of the more obscure conventions and aspects of higher ed. And then our second event was a panel discussion with students. And our two events this semester have focused on slightly more particular topics that grew out of those first two events. And we'll say more about why this topic in particular in a moment. I just want to start with a little bit of housekeeping. In terms of asking questions, you can use the chat feature to type in a question, but you're also welcome and encouraged to use the anonymous form to submit questions without attribution. And you'll see instructions about how to do that in the chat. If you have technical issues, again, please use the chat to let us know, and someone from our events team will reach out and help you. I want to start the actual substance of our event tonight by introducing our two wonderful speakers. The first is Dr. Marquez-Lewis. She is the director of the psychology program here at CUNY SPS and a distinguished lecturer in that program. And our other speaker is Erin Jeanette, who is a licensed clinical psychologist and the head of counseling services at SPS. We're really delighted to have both of them. I will be moderating the event, really just kind of the master of ceremonies, and I'll be fielding questions in the chat as well as our speakers are talking, or do my best to. We will have a designated Q&A portion at the end of the event as well. So for now, I'll actually turn things over right away to Dr. Marquez-Lewis, who can tell us a little bit about why this topic in particular. So Carla, over to you.
Great, thank you. So as Dr. Alsop mentioned, we started this as a series, and we quickly learned that students were drawn to particular topics, and one of them happened to be this topic. It's not surprising, right? Because it is a very widespread phenomenon that occurs, but the students had a very strong response. We got some emails about this. Students reached out to us to talk a little bit about their experiences. And when you are in an academic setting, especially if it's a setting that you're not familiar with, right? A new endeavor, something that you haven't experienced before, you're trying to learn to navigate it. And the things that you're most uncomfortable talking about are usually the things that you end up emailing about. And so we realized that this was probably something we needed to shine a light on and to let students know that they're not alone. This happens to a lot of people, most people at some point in their lives, and that we wanted to give you some skills, some coping mechanisms, some ways to deal with it so that you know what to do when it happens. So the imposter syndrome is also called the imposter phenomenon. You might hear it called perceived fraudulence. Any of these are really used interchangeably, but what it is, we'll explain in a second, but we know that it's happening everywhere. So research shows that it's not just in academia, it's at work, it's in your home life, it's in your relationships, and we're gonna focus on the academic setting. But even within that academic setting, it's happening to faculty members, it's happening to people in administration, and it's happening to students. So when I say you're not alone, I don't mean just in terms of other students. Everyone on the campus is experiencing this as well in different ways, and it's manifesting itself, in different activities or different settings. Yours may happen to be in a classroom. So the reason why it's also important is not just because students are interested, it's because it has a very far-reaching and very serious implications. It can impact people's mental health, it can impact their well-being, it can impact their grades, it can impact whether or not they decide to stay in college. And so especially in terms of, as a faculty member, we want you to stay. And so we would hate for this to be the reason that you leave. So we really want to talk a little bit more about
it. Sorry, let me advance the slide for you here. There we go.
Great. So imposter syndrome originally began as a concept by Pauline Clance and Susan Imes, who in the 70s were looking particularly at very high functioning, high achieving women. And what they noticed in their interviews with them is that these women, despite having lots of evidence to the contrary, could not internalize their own successes. And they really believed that all of these things that were happening to them in terms of their abilities, their knowledge, were really something that they were going to be outed soon, right? They didn't own them. They didn't absorb that sort of success. So they had a lot of intellectual self-doubt. They felt fraudulent in situations, unworthy of the praise that they were getting. We were just talking shortly before this about, being invited to talks, right? And similar things for these women, being invited to serve as heads of projects, being invited to be speakers, et cetera. They would wonder why anyone wanted them to do this, because they themselves did not feel that they were experts or worthy of that kind of praise. So when someone has this inability to absorb their achievements and recognize the abilities that they have, they oftentimes spend a lot of time, and Dr. Jeanette will talk more about this, but a lot of mental energy, right, in thinking about ways to not be found out. And so they also do this internal sort of dance of saying that all of their skills, all of their knowledge, all of their success is really not about them or anything that they've done or any skills that they possess. It's really just luck, right? They've been lucky along the way. They also attribute it to the environment having lowered the standards so that they can meet them. So it's not that they're this special exception. It's that, well, people must be lowering the standards a little bit. So in an example, might be, in one of the articles that I was taking a look at, it was talking about the woman feeling that they got in by luck because they needed a woman, right? So maybe it was a field like engineering or a topic where women aren't well represented, and that the woman didn't deserve to be there. She just got there because they needed a woman. And so that lowering of standards really changes the way people feel about their achievements. People have attributed their skills and their abilities and their intellect to timing, right? To their networking, to their charm, which I love. So that's good that people feel charming, and even to their presentation skills. And this one I think is particularly interesting because it's really about people feeling that they're where they are because they've been very good at tricking people, right? Or creating this facade. And so people are not able to see exactly who they really are, or who they think they really are. Can we go ahead and advance the slide? Great. So this fear of being found out, right? So if you're in an academic setting, and I'll talk about it specifically there, you might often look around the room and feel like you don't deserve to be in that class. You don't deserve to be, an A student, someone selected for an A scholarship, someone selected for an honors project. That any day now, people are going to figure out that you're not smart enough to be there, you're not capable enough to be there, and that they're going to find you out. And once they do, there's going to be consequences for that. So this heightened sense of constantly self-monitoring, I mean, you can imagine how much work has to be done to be constantly thinking about how you're presenting. And I think it's important to recognize that we are all doing a little bit of this all the time, right? So there's the self that you present to your friends, the self you present at work, the self you present, in different settings. But this is a bit beyond, right? It's this idea that the self-monitoring really never ends, and this constant impression management, partnered with this need for perfection, it ends up creating this huge weight. And then you add to that the flip side of that, which is that people who suffer from imposter phenomenon and imposter syndrome often internalize their failures. So they're less likely to absorb their successes, but more likely to internalize failure. And so what you get, unfortunately, is a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, low self-esteem, especially in academic settings, but also in work settings. We see procrastination because people don't want to get started on something that they think they're not going to be able to achieve to this very heightened level that they think is expected of them. and they're afraid they are not actually going to be able to meet it because they don't actually have the skills to get there. So it's all just this vicious cycle. Unfortunately, what can often happen is that there's a need to escape. In academic settings, we see this in students withdrawing, right? They decide that they're just going to ghost their professor or ghost the class because they're not really deserving of being there. And so when we look at all of this, you can see already that this picture of stress, this picture of anxiety, this picture of well-being or the lack of well-being, it can be very detrimental to a student, right? Or anyone who's experiencing this. Go ahead and advance one more. Great. So when we think about the imposter phenomenon, we can wonder where does it come from? And there's a lot of different theories about where this comes from, but I'll share some of them. And again, I want to just point out there's not any one thing that's causing this. It's a combination of things. So the society that we live in, that in and of itself has a huge stress on achievement, right? I mean, think about the environment that we live in. Everybody is trying to achieve something. And so that stress and that pressure is put on students or workers or whoever it happens to be. In academia, there is a particular culture that we talked about in the first event. For those of you who attended, you might remember, and for those of you who didn't, we talked a lot about this whole culture of academia that tends to be about keeping people out, creating a very strong signal that certain things are acceptable, certain things that aren't. Certain people are in, certain people are out. And if you don't know how to manage and to navigate this culture of academia, we can see this imposter phenomenon coming about more often. We also can see this with familial pressures. So particularly some research has shown that those who are the first in their family to exceed norms, so including their educational goals, are more likely to experience imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon. And think about that as first generation students, these are the norms that they're exceeding, right? Going to school when no one else has in their family, achieving a degree when no one else has achieved that. It can be particular personality characteristics that tend to lend themselves more to imposter syndrome. Things like neuroticism tend to lend themselves more to imposter phenomenon. And as I started this, I mentioned, being more common when you're embarking on a new challenge or a new role. And think about first generation students coming into a new environment of academia, one they're not familiar with. They don't know anyone else who's ever attended college in some instances. And so this becomes not only a new challenge, but a new role. They're now taking on this student role that they have no familiarity with other than maybe grade school, and college, is much different. Likewise, we see that it's more common in anyone who is differing from a majority. So now we can add on these other layers of intersectionality, race, gender, SES, et cetera. And you see these things are sort of exacerbating and building. And then finally, we have this lack of belonging. And we know from the research that belonging actually fosters confidence. So if you feel like you don't belong, which a lot of first generation students feel they don't belong in the academic environment that is constantly telling them they don't belong, then we're going to end up in a situation where first generation students become particularly susceptible to imposter phenomenon. So I want to pass it over though to Dr. Jeanette, who can get a little bit more into the specifics of some of the core experiences of imposter phenomenon, ways that it can cause difficulties, and ways that you can learn to overcome it, and you can learn some coping mechanisms to manage it.
Okay, great. I'm going to stop sharing, and Erin, I'll let you share.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marquez-Lewis, for setting that up and giving us so much helpful information. Let me just share my screen here. Can everyone see?
Looks great.
Wonderful. All right. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me here to talk about this topic tonight. It's one of interest to me because it is so globally experienced. You know, what I do in my day-to-day work is do psychotherapy with all kinds of folks and across so many different identities and experiences. These are feelings that show up often. So I'm appreciative of, I think, how broadly applicable some of these ideas we hope will be. What I'm going to run through tonight, this is just kind of an overview. We're going to talk a little bit about the feelings that go along with the imposter experiences in more depth. We're going to talk about two of the things that fuel those processes, which is the role of the unconscious and also the role of the nervous system. We're going to talk about some less adaptive coping behaviors and styles that most of us tend to fall into when we're in the throes of these big feelings. And then we're going to talk about some strategies to overcome those experiences. And threaded throughout, I want to invite all of us to be thinking about the relationship between imposter experiences and systemic inequity and injustice, because these are kind of like, it's like a Venn diagram that overlaps in very interesting ways. They are separate, they are not synonymous experiences, but the overlaps are complex. And I think that's the opportunity of this evening, is to think about that in greater depth. I think some key features just to review is that the imposter experience is almost always context driven. And I think that's a helpful question to ask oneself when you're in the throes of these experiences. Or do I feel these ways across the board? Or is there something about a particular context that tends to push on these experiences for me? As Dr. Marquez-Lewis mentioned, the experience, the nature of this experience is isolating. That's actually part of what the experience is feeling alone in it. So it's helpful to know that the prevalence is actually very high. I think in one study I read, 70% of individuals who were interviewed in a workplace said that they have had this experience in their career. First generation students may have a vulnerability to those experiences because of the changing settings, because of the novelty of the settings. And very important to say, and I think this is on my mind because I'm a mental health professional. I think about people ask me about their diagnoses. Imposter experiences or imposter syndrome is not a mental illness, and it is not a diagnosis. So this is something that what we would call non-clinical populations experience. So this is part of normal human experience. These very unsettling experiences that can feel very not normal when we're in them. We feel like, I don't feel myself and I don't feel okay. But they are not a mental illness or diagnoses. I think the word syndrome is a bit misleading. The thing that I like about, I don't love borrowing things like from medical ease, but I think that what is helpful about it is that it cues us that it warrants our care and attention. But that's the one time I like borrowing medical language where it doesn't fit, is if it helps someone feel legitimate in seeking care and attention and support, because this is an experience that needs one. So the core experiences, as we said, shame, fraudulence, fears of exposure, feelings about the inevitability of exposure. Oh, it's going to happen someday. And the belief that the consequences of the exposure might be terrible and irreparable. And I put these just independently on this slide because these feelings sound very big. Like there's a kind of a melodrama about the words we use to describe this. But if we translate it into some everyday experiences, many people can recognize these experiences. So shame, that's such a big word. No one wakes up in the morning, or not no one, that's a misnomer, but many people don't immediately identify shame as something that they're feeling. They feel, I feel weird, I feel awkward, and it takes an extra layer to say, is this shame? But that statement of I feel different and less than other people here, that's a shame experience. Fraudulence, I'm doing fine in this class, but that just covers up that I'm not as smart or as well prepared or as well spoken. That's an experience of fraudulence. Fears of exposure, if I'm not careful, people will know. inevitability of exposure. I'm doing okay, but I probably won't be able to keep it up. And belief that the consequences of exposure are terrible and irreparable. Again, those words are so big, but some folks will say, I think that if I'm uncovered, my professor will no longer give me the benefit of the doubt. They'll think I don't belong here. They won't read my paper carefully. It's similar to a feeling of like exile. It's actually a really big feeling. Imposter feelings, because they're so big underneath these very everyday sentences, like I feel like I don't belong here. That's an everyday sentence that many people have uttered in various settings. If we know, though, that underneath that may be an experience of shame, it helps us understand why the experience can feel so overwhelming and confusing. It's because within that everyday experience, there's actually a quite big emotion in there, and big emotions really activate us. They overwhelm, they confuse. And what our mind, because our minds are very brilliant and they are used to protecting us and keeping us safe, what we can sometimes do is move those big feelings out of our awareness. So we don't, like I said, people aren't prone to describe their feelings in terms of shame or fraudulence. But even if we're not describing it in that big way, something big may be going on inside us. And even more, that big thing may be outside of our awareness, but we're behaving in response to it. And we can't figure out why we're behaving in the way that we are. That's how that unconscious process works. The feeling is kind of a little unhooked from our conscious experience. So we have this very unsettling experience that we don't know why we're doing what we're doing. And that can be a little unsettling and scary. I like to think of the unconscious as doing things that hide and yell at the same time. It hides in that we can't really identify what we're feeling, but it yells in the sense that the behavior can sometimes be quite noticeable and quite consequential. So one thing to know about these big emotions is that they tend to activate our fight or flight system. And we'll see kind of these little mini, like in an experience where you're feeling a little ashamed or like you don't belong, that increases our heart rate, our blood pressure, our saliva, our digestion. This whole body experience is what's happening when we have these kind of thoughts that feel very everyday. It's helpful to think that might be going on in my body when I'm having that thought. These are active. The fight or flight system also activates, it was designed to protect us from predators. And so some people will say, well, why am I feeling this in a classroom? There are no predators. I think we are designed to interpret interpersonal and social threat as just as serious a threat as physical threat. So it doesn't matter that no one's chasing us in that classroom. Interpersonal threat activates that system just as strongly as physical threat. And in fact, it's more of a challenge, because if it were a physical threat, we would be able to use the energy that comes from that nervous system activation. When it's an interpersonal or social threat, there's not as much place for that energy to go, and it tends to make us very uncomfortable. And I want to kind of show how that works. So when we have any kind of experience that feels like a threat to us, physical or interpersonal, we get that elevated heart rate. Now, if that were a survival behavior, we would use that heart rate to run fast, to fight hard. When we're in a classroom, that heart rate has nowhere to go. We're sitting still. We feel panicky. We feel lightheaded, dilated pupils. If we're running, sharpens our vision. We can take in a lot. In the classroom, that might actually feel like sensory overload. The words keep coming at me. The professor, they can have these overwhelming experiences. We get the nausea, the butterflies in our stomach. Those are all signs that your nervous system might be active. When our nervous system gets active, and we have the recognition that actual fighting or running isn't necessary, we have this brilliant brain, again, that comes in and down-regulates the system, or it tries to, for us. So an example of how this would show up in a classroom, how do we down-regulate? If thinking about logging in for that class makes us uncomfortable, we automatically have this little system that says, oh, butterflies, downregulate, maybe I'll skip it. I won't log in today. Hearing others make smart comments makes us nervous. We might just kind of check out a little bit. Done, taken care of. I didn't quite hear that smart comment. Or we might get active and start over attending to our own comment in a way that makes it hard to think. If we feel anxious about talking with authority figures, we can avoid that conflict entirely by dropping out of the communication, or sometimes we're going to talk about this spectrum of underactivity versus overactivity, because this is where we see the kind of the behaviors that give us that moment of, I'm doing these things, but I don't know why I'm doing these things sometimes. So we kind of, when our nervous system gets very active this way, and imposter experiences activate us a lot, actually, we can develop these kind of less adaptive ways of adjusting our behavior to try to calm ourselves down. And over time, these behaviors can become coping styles where we get a groove that we get in. And some of the things that emerge as coping styles are perfectionism. It's kind of an overactive coping style where we're overworking, we have trouble relaxing, we never feel done with our projects. Perfectionism tends to come in two big varieties: error avoidance, which is like scanning your work constantly to make sure that it's just perfect, perfect, perfect. Some of that is adaptive and good. We want to edit our work. But it comes from that unsettling feeling that when you turn it in, it probably still wasn't right. You wake up thinking maybe there were mistakes in there. And then comprehensiveness, that's feeling like you need to be the expert in everything all the time and not really being able to let projects go until you feel you are. Defeatism, avoiding things that feel challenging. If you don't understand immediately, don't do it all. You know, like that experience where we show up to the first day of class and we're like, I'm dropping this thing. Now that might be a feeling to listen to and to say, maybe I don't have the prerequisite. We'll talk in a minute about how to check those facts to see how to make those decisions adaptively. Another coping style is help avoidance. Because you're afraid of exposure, sometimes we don't want to talk with anybody about what's going on. It's a cover-up. But actually, that's kind of disappearing from an interaction that might help us answer our true question. And then the last coping style is undercrediting yourself. So again, as we've discussed, difficulty accepting positive feedback, and kind of trying to lower others' expectations. And obviously these are self-defeating styles because perfectionism, we burn out. It's overwork. No one can sustain that level of nervous system activation all the time. So we burn out. We lose opportunities. We lose opportunities both for learning and also for help and relationships and to really be understood and seen. And we lose the opportunity for understanding our strengths and our areas for growth in a realistic way. So how do we address, we've outlined all of the not so good things that can come from these experiences. What do we do? What do we do? And I'm going to say awareness for me is half the battle. Knowing that this is a thing that can happen to people and might be happening to you is a good question to ask, because it invites you to think about all that stuff we pushed to the unconscious area and to invite it back in and say, hey, what are the big feelings that I might be having? How do you raise your self-awareness? Introspection, thinking, exploring, talking to people. We're doing it right now. This is kind of step one of raising that awareness. And I always recommend when we're on a self-awareness project to think of these three areas: your thoughts, your feelings, your bodily experiences. So an example of a thought is that very talky place that our mind gets into sometimes. I don't belong in this school, in this class, in college. Your feelings: awkwardness, weirdness, Like weird is a very like catch-all term, but everyone also knows what it means. Like I feel weird. If you're feeling weird, that's a moment to say, what's going on with me? Frustration, sadness, and think about all those feelings and kind of get really good at labeling them too. The more words you have for feelings, the better off you are. And your bodily experiences, butterflies, muscle tension, keyed up and wired. If you're having a bodily experience in some kind of academic or career interaction or family whatever it is, don't assume you just drank too much caffeine that day. Invite the question, might this have something to do with my feelings in this context or my thoughts in this context? I'm going to take them one by one now. Thoughts, feelings, and bodily experiences. How do you work with each of those to actually make them feel better? In the domain of thoughts, I think the most useful thing to think about is to ask yourself what stories you're telling yourself. And I don't mean stories as in untruths, like myths, but what I mean are stories, there are many ways to describe a life. There are many narratives that we can use. And some of those narratives focus on strengths and others focus on areas of pain. And I think that it's important to say, how am I telling myself this story? What language do I use? Am I telling myself this story in the way that I would tell a friend their biography? Or does my story telling for myself have more cruelty in it than seems appropriate or that I would use for others? And check the evidence for those stories once you've figured them out, and be balanced. I always like to say, like, it's not good to cherry pick data, if you're a researcher. Also not good to cherry pick data when you're examining your own narratives. And in this case, it's often sour cherry picking, because we will say to ourselves, okay, I got a D and I got an A. Somehow that D like weighs 100% of everything and that A weighs nothing. If you were to do that in a research project, that would be statistically out the window because you can't do that with data. A D is, is worth the same as an A. And that's the kind of checking your facts that you want to do on those stories. And you're going to have to consciously revise those stories. It feels awkward at first. That's my experience working with folks. It feels awkward to change a story. Wait, I'm going to say that this was a great achievement. Yeah, we're going to try that on for size and see if the language helps. Working with feelings. This is actually it's like a simple, not simple process. Set aside time in your day. I would recommend doing this every day, not just in the throes of imposter experience, but all the time, to just ask yourself what you're feeling and to make sure that you accept the answers that your mind and body and your heart, your soul, whatever language you have to describe that part of you that feels real. Don't push away what it's trying to tell you, even if it's trying to tell you something hard. Because, I'm looking at my slide and I can't see the whole slide, but there's the word fun. Do you guys see that? Do you have?
Yeah, it says funny and then anger and sadness. So I don't know if that was your unconscious, Erin. That was,
I think it was. Yeah. It's a true unconscious communication about how I'm trying to engage with these feelings, which is that we want to be really open, loving, light, even though they're not funny feelings. We want to try to embrace that lightness in them. And because pushed away feelings tend to come back, whereas processed feelings can help us move forward. The way to use feelings is if you push them out of the way, they will come back in the same unhelpful form that they did the first time. And then also working with the body and bodily experience. Set aside time in your day, again, just to notice the things that are happening in your body. There are some tried and true ways to do this, by the way, I've put these terms here so you can check them out on your own. I can tell you, like a body scan inventory is just starting from your feet, your toes, and doing part by part all the way up your body, being like, what am I feeling in my feet? What am I feeling in my calves? What am I feeling in my thighs? What am I feeling in my stomach? Because those are the spots where you're going to notice, ooh, muscle tension, ooh, butterflies. And that's going to cue you to say, what's going on with that? What is my body trying to tell me about how I'm feeling and thinking right now? And if you notice that if your body feels unpleasantly overactive, that should cue a bunch of questions about what you're thinking and what you're feeling. But you can also downregulate with helpful strategies rather than unhelpful strategies, where like an unhelpful strategy is kind of checking out, or downregulating yourself with withdrawal. A more helpful strategy is to do breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation. That will allow you to calm your body down without some of the negative side effects that come, the interpersonal side effects of withdrawal or overactivity. And, you know, a key feature that I have found to be very clinically useful goes back to thinking about our fight or flight system and how it activates. And two really great words to rephrase fight or flight that help us understand how it shows up in interpersonal domains are avoidance and overactivity. When our nervous systems get activated, we almost all have a lean. We have a way that we lean in order to make that experience better for ourselves. We can either be avoiders or overactors, and sometimes both, depending on the context. So be open to that too. It's like introverted and extroverted. The context matters. But avoidance examples are when I feel like an imposter, I stop participating, I stop asking for help, I disappear, I get distracted, I start missing deadlines. Overactivity is I rewrite every sentence of my paper 50 times. I have trouble waiting for feedback. Refresh, write the professor, did you look at this yet? Refresh again, asking for clarifications on things that you actually understand. Being in a flurry of activity, asking other people what they're doing. That's all time that you might actually take to reflect and think, but it's you trying to use that energy, that fight or flight energy. Once you figure out what your lean is, try to love it. The fact that you have a lean is actually evidence of your system trying to survive and thrive. We never want to I want to say put down your lean. We're glad that you have one. What we're always trying to do is balance it out. So if you tend to be an avoider, you can say, I'm just going to attend those 3 more classes. I can disappear later. Look, you can ghost somebody anytime. That's the magic of ghosting, is that it happens at unexpected times. So one way you can kind of help yourself around that is to say, I can do it. I can escape. I can run away, but not now. I'm going to try to push one step forward. I'll reach out to that professor and I'll let them know I'm feeling underconfident. Maybe I'll answer that email from my professor about how I'm doing. If you tend to be an overactive person, you can balance yourself by just slowing down. I'm going to take an hour to figure out the assignment before I email those 15 classmates. If you take that hour and you still don't know, go for it. Use your lean to ask people. That's great. Wait for that grade, knowing that you have good enough instincts about how to do the work. Maybe rewrite your sentence just 3 times and then ask for some feedback. And then, so those are really the strategies for kind of helping yourself get through these really, really activating experiences of big feelings. I think an important element to discuss, and we've kind of touched on it already, is that many discussions about imposter syndrome really leave out the influence of oppression and injustice. It's there, but I think it's not as explicitly discussed because the focuses of those different forms of communication sometimes is different, research versus other settings. But I think there is a problem in some imposter syndrome research where it kind of assumes a background of equity that might not exist in certain environments. Because there's a difference between feeling out of place and being made to feel out of place, which is one of the kind of racism, microaggressions, macroaggressions. These are kind of experiences that, whether they're done consciously or unconsciously by the environment or a particular person, have the effect of making someone feel out of place. That's not an individual factor. And it's important not to put the entire onus on an individual to fix themselves when in fact social change is necessary. And because people in groups who've been subject to injustice and oppression are less represented, that's the definition of systemic racism. That's one of its effects. There might be susceptibility to those experiences because of the lesser representation in X context or Y context. Now, and one thing that I like about the coping strategies for imposter syndrome is that they are essentially strategies that are about introspection and working with yourself. So the same strategies that can be used to counteract an imposter experience can also be used to discern, is this an imposter experience? Or am I experiencing the result of systemic oppression, injustice? Those same techniques of checking your thoughts, looking at your feelings, and looking at your bodily experiences. If someone were in my office and saying, how can I tell if these what's going on with these microaggressions that I experience? I would recommend those same 3 introspection tools. They would lead to different action. Let's say through those, you use those tools and you discern that in fact, this environment is not supportive to you. That might lead to calls for social change. That's a different mode of activity that follows, but the tools for discernment are the same. And that's what I like about, about the fact that they can be used to support both experiences. That's it. This is just a summary that I'll leave on your screen to kind of walk you through, but that's from me. Thank you for giving me those few minutes to talk.
Dr. Jeanette, I'm sure I speak for some of the participants. That was absolutely mind-blowing. I wish I had this presentation as a student and graduate student myself. So thank you so much for sharing this. It was so rich. I think we have about 15 minutes for questions. We do have some pre-submitted questions. I want to go ahead and encourage everyone to use the Q&A feature to ask questions. And as I'm pulling up some questions, Dr. Marquez-Lewis, I just wanted to see if there are any responses you wanted to share or thoughts listening to that presentation.
I mean, I think particularly the last slide, I think is one. I mean, I think it's all informative, right? The students understand the ways in which they can help themselves and also reach out for help. But I think Dr. Jeanette raises a really great point that isn't talked about enough, which is, when is it something you're experiencing, and when is it something you would be expected and should be experiencing, because everything about the structure is created to make you feel that way. And one of the things that we talked about, Dr. Alsop, at our first event, navigating academia, and it was about demystifying academia, and really pulling the curtain back to say, like, this is all a structural thing, right? I mean, historically, the people that went to college look very different than the people who go to college now. And yet all of those systems and all of those structures are still in place. So if you feel out of place and you feel like you don't belong, that's by design, right? And in some instances, because as I put in the chat, it would take a big overhaul and a whole lot of work to create a very welcoming environment for everyone. So, but even still, as Dr. Jeanette points out, having the coping skills can be used in either of those situations, whether or not you're being made to feel one way and responding to it, or you're reacting to something that actually maybe it is more something internal that you're experiencing and less about the context. But I think the thing that I would like to hammer home to students is that your professors, and maybe I'm a little pleading on behalf of professors, being one myself, we are here to help you. And as I put in the chat, sometimes knowing that you have a leaning as Dr. Jeanette was talking about, if I know as a professor that you're an avoid, someone who tends to lean towards avoidance, and you let me know that, you could say it outright, or you can say, I tend to disappear. Then I know that I need to kind of keep after you, right? Or I need to reach out to you. I need to say to you, what can I do to you to help you feel like you don't have to do that? Or if I know that you're someone who tends to lead to overactivity, and I have those students and I can recognize them very quickly because they tend to email me, right, multiple times in a 24-hour period of time. That's okay. We can have a conversation about that. But I think the whole crux of every topic that we have is all about making connections and relationships, because that can be really helpful. And we want you to stay and we want you to succeed. So anything that we can do to help you, we're happy to do that. And Dr. Jeanette's office is also available for people that need help. So those are my initial thoughts.
That's great. And I love the idea of sort of identifying your own lean, because, it really is part of, I think also, giving students a new level of metacognitive awareness about how those unconscious processes may be inhibiting their ability to learn, right? So that it's not just about, oh, I can't get started on my paper because I haven't read enough, right? There's something else at work there. And so I think, I think just having this language and framework is so useful. I do want to talk or throw out to both of you a question that was pre-submitted that maybe deals with a slightly less optimal situation where maybe a student is dealing with a less amenable faculty member. So the student wrote, how do you deal with people specifically in an academic setting, for instance, professors and students and staff, that prompt you to feel like an imposter? For example, making you feel like your goals are too lofty, pointing out every flaw, using your ethics against you. So it sounds like maybe a more pointed sort of interpersonal situation that might be challenging or activating to the student. So for either of you.
Dr. Jeanette, do you want to take that? I think you kind of talked about some of it in your talk.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say first thing, number one, is to have compassion for yourself in a moment like that. Like that can feel like a real, or that is, I mean, like that is like a wound, So, and I think that thinking of oneself as warranting care in a moment like that can help you cool the internal temperature. Like when we're hurt, like that sounds like an injury to me, right? Like a psychic injury. And anytime we're dealing with any injury situation, I think our first goal is to kind of tend to the psychological wound so that we can then think of a strategy about how we're either going to work with ourselves or work in the environment in order to help it feel better. I think working with yourself then is you're making a decision about kind of whether the critique of those lofty goals feels like a critique that you're going to accept. Like you have when we can cool our nervous system off enough, we can make that very kind of, I want to say, careful analysis of what, if anything, from that difficult feedback was worth taking away versus what needs to be discarded and moved on, or even actively countered. And there are different pathways for doing that depending on how, how appropriate or inappropriate you feel that happened. But I think the first thing is to feel okay regarding it as an injury, tend to the injury. And then once you have that spaciousness to consider what is the validity of this, if any, I think those help.
I think you raised a good point too, Dr. Jeanette, when you were talking about looking for different data points. So, not being so quick to say this D is everything, right? And when you have an A or several A's that show something to the contrary, so maybe looking for additional, counter data, as you pointed out, things that maybe say this actually isn't a lofty goal. This is completely doable. And I know this because I've done A, B, and C already in my life. especially when people might have told you that you couldn't. The fact that you are in college, I mean, just that one thing I think is something that people aren't proud enough about. You know, you, as a first generation student, you've already accomplished so much and have something to kind of put in your back pocket as proof that you have grit, that you have resilience, that you have a lot of really great things, skills, knowledge, intelligence, to be where you are. And, you know, that it's not an easy feat, especially for those students who come from true backgrounds where they know no one who went to college. They have no one in their family and their extended families. The fact that you are sitting in a classroom is quite an accomplishment, because it took a lot of really great attributes to get you there, things that you possess that got you where you are. So don't forget that, because you know that those, you already have so many great things going for you.
Well, and I can offer up a little case study. This is not clinically approved at all, but my first semester of teaching, you know, I got my student evaluations back. This is my first full-time teaching job. And, you know, most of them were pretty positive. They were helpful. One student wrote this very long comment. And, you know, I would say that some of it was, you know, less relevant, but there were some really good germs of truth in there. But I was so wounded by the kind of negative comments. And I think also immediately just went into kind of a tailspin of, I'm a complete imposter. I'm a fraud. What am I doing teaching college? This is so terrible. And, you know, one of the things that came out of that after talking with a colleague was both to take the kind of pause that we've been talking about and wait till I was in a moment where I could do a kind of validity check, but also put together like a little sort of archive of sort of positive things, right? Like nice notes I had gotten over the years, things that I could look to remember my strengths. And, you know, that was something that I think we all, maybe some of us do that or have gotten that advice, but, you know, in those moments, I have found it really helpful to remember like, oh no, I have done some stuff. This is good. So, you know, I think also figuring out what works for you. And if there's a practice that you have found salutary and supportive of your own well-being, you know, again, I'm not speaking clinically, but you know, I think we have to kind of, you know, we're all individuals and figure out what works sometimes.
I can endorse that clinically. Like we talk all the time about having little storehouses of like, to the point of like stuff on your phone, like that's like in the notes, like your best professor feedback being in the notes on your phone. So you can just read it and love it.
Yeah. And like, just cherish that. It's like, it's there for you. We've been talking about the academic setting, but one of the questions we got ahead of time was about sort of a social context. So the student wrote, what can I do if I have imposter syndrome that presents in my friendships? And for example, thinking a person doesn't want to be my friend or that I'm not enough for them. And I think probably we could extend this into family relationships as well, maybe.
Yeah, I think the same, I can just jump in. Like, I think the same concepts apply. And I think this shows up everywhere. This shows up in parenting experiences, that shows up in friendship experiences, because it's all about something that we aspire to do well. So anything we aspire to do well or to have, I think we're going to be susceptible in those areas to these experiences that we may be in danger of not doing it the way that we want to ensure its continuation. Like, I think that's also a concern about continuity of wanting to have these things. I think the same strategies can help kind of make a start to digging out of that kind of experience. I think I would, in the realm of social and family experiences, though, I think one of the places that you can take, you know, that self-awareness forms a foundation to then take some sort of action. And we talked about academic actions, but in the context of, say, a friendship or a family relationship, that action might be a conversation about really understanding what it is that the person looks for in a friend and what it is that you feel you can provide as a friend, and thinking about. So I think that those introspection, the calming down tools lead the way to different actions in a friendship than the academic space. but it all leads the way to freer action, which is what I think the goal is.
We also had a question here that I think, again, touches maybe on your last slide, Dr. Jeanette. The student was particularly interested in hearing you both share your thoughts on a particular article, Jodi Ann Boris and Rachika Tulashan's Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome. I'm not sure if you are familiar with that. They included a quote that said, from this article, the imposter syndrome is especially prevalent in biased, toxic cultures that value individualism and overwork. And that the answer to overcoming imposter syndrome is not to fix individuals, but to create an environment that fosters a variety of leadership styles and in which diverse racial, ethnic, and gender identities are seen as just as professional as the current model. I think this comes back to your point, Dr. Marquez-Lewis, about really kind of structural transformation. So I don't know if you wanted to speak to this.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's the same as sort of what we were talking about before, that that there are structures, right? I mean, there are patriarchal structures that are not welcoming to women, that women are treated differently. We can look at the very practical things like wage gaps, and so it is real. And I think I would just say that the same strategies that you would use in any setting for which there is oppression and social injustice would apply to this as well. I mean, there's been plenty of research about imposter syndrome that does suggest that when you're a minority in a setting too, not just the structural sort of inequities, but when you're a minority, so if you're a woman in a particular field or a particular job. So let me think of if you were, in sports, for example, right? If you were a sports commentator, you're a woman dominated in this sort of male environment, you're going to feel imposter syndrome more so. And so you may have to dig deep into that toolbox that Dr. Jeanette was talking about. But I think any situation whether it's race, gender, SES, et cetera, anytime you're the minority, I think it's going to show up more. So, I mean, I think imposter syndrome is real for women, but I think they're talking about two different things, right? One is where there's a structural inequity that is real and you're being made to feel one way, as Dr. Jeanette pointed out, and the other is maybe you are thriving in an environment and still struggling with imposter syndrome.
I want to just note that we're 1 minute from 7 o'clock. We're happy to stay on, I think, until about 7:10. And we do have a couple more questions here coming in through the Q&A. But obviously, for anyone that needs to leave, please feel free. And this is being recorded, and I think will be shared with the participants after the fact. So if anyone does need to leave, thanks so much for coming. But stay on if you'd like to, and we'll keep going for another 10 minutes or so. So we had a question from Cassandra about resources. She was particularly interested in knowing the topic of, I think, the 1970s research that you mentioned, Dr. Marquez-Lewis.
Yeah, it was a 1978 study that really sort of kicked this all off. And we're putting together right now on the new SPS website a first gen series section, and we'll put the resources there. But I can also send out a reference list of things that you can read, including that article or that journal article that kind of started everything. And you can take a look at it and see what you think. You're also welcome. And at the end of this, we'll show the first gen email address. You can email us if you have questions or if you want to talk a little more about the article. There's nothing more that professors love more than talking about articles. So feel free to reach out after you do take a look at it, but I'm happy to share it.
That's great. And then we have a question from Grant. Hi, Grant. Is there a connection or relationship between imposter syndrome and a fear of success? That success would increase attention or greater expectation that increases the chance of failure? Dr. Jeanette, do you want to?
Sure. I think there is a relationship between those things. And I think it is operating at several levels. Grant, firstly, on the level that you've described beautifully with the question, right? That success tends to bring a certain type of attention. I think another connection there is around unconscious process, actually, and how active our unconscious can get, in the sense that I think that we can oftentimes feel very committed to success, and the fear doesn't register quite so much. So I think there's a link to in how active our unconscious mind might be in both imposter experiences and experiences of fear of success. I had another, wait, where, maybe it'll come to me. I had a third thought, but the other one is kind of about loyalties. I think that if our successes feel to us that they might take us away from some setting of origin, or create a separation between us and a setting of origin. And again, that can be constructed in all different ways in the way you think about it, whatever that is, whatever you're leaving or staying in. But I think that success is not only induces fear because of the attention it brings, but also because it might mean some kind of separation from something familiar. And I think that's another spot where our unconscious gets very active, because our unconscious really likes homeostasis and sometimes psychological things staying the same.
Yeah,
Dr. Marquez-Lewis, did you want to jump in?
I mean, I would just say that there is research too that, talks about that cycle of, you do really well in an environment, and that brings on more scrutiny, usually praise, because you don't handle praise very well or absorb it, then it actually ends up being this really difficult loop that people find themselves in, because once you get that praise and that heightened sort of spotlight on you, now you have to perform, and now you feel this sort of anxiety about performing. So I mean, I think they are intricately, woven together. But I think imposter syndrome is a little less about a fear of success and more about how we internalize the success. Do we recognize it? Do we absorb it when we've achieved it? Can we say, oh, I've achieved this, or I'm really a great writer, or I'm really a good student? I can't tell you how many students tell me that they're terrible students, and that phrase, I'm a terrible student, I'm terrible at math, I'm terrible at, et cetera, when they're not terrible at it. They just can't seem to absorb the successes that they do have. And even when you point them out, they just can't see it. And so I think, fear of success, on the other hand, is a little bit different, right? But they certainly have a relationship.
Yeah, and I've noticed, again, sort of anecdotally sometimes, back to that point about, I guess, dealing with particularly hurtful critiques, that students tend to outsource a lot of authority to professors, right? And so really give them the power to sort of adjudicate whether or not I'm a success, or this is good, or this is bad. And so there is this sort of way in which they become, there's one student told me once that she had become kind of an approval addict, right? That she needed that extrinsic approval because she but then without it fell into this like total quagmire of self-doubt, right? About whether she could do anything without that external validation. And Cassandra, speaking of, kind of support, is putting in the chat, and I think in our Q&A, that there's a support group specifically for, looks like female entrepreneurs dealing with imposter syndrome. So thank you for sharing that, Cassandra. That sounds great.
I wanted to just mention one more thing that I think is important, and that is supported by research, is that the people who tend to suffer from imposter syndrome often are very high achieving people. So, the doubts that come are really in and of themselves just so counter to what is actually happening. So, for example, right, graduate students, that we see this in all different areas, but graduate students in particular, there's been a lot of research done on them, because the amount of imposter phenomenon that's happening among graduate students, I mean, so pervasive. And these are students who are getting into PhD programs where they're accepting 3 or 5 or 6 people, and yet they still cannot internalize the fact that they were selected from this very, very high performing group of students to be in these programs, and they still don't see it. So, I think it's worth mentioning, because if you do, experience imposter syndrome, it's probably likely that you are probably, high achieving in and of itself. So just something to think about.
Any final questions from the audience in our last 3 minutes? As folks think, I'm going to pull just share my screen one more time so that everyone can see our email address, which I also shared in the chat. And just as a reminder, we don't have our event schedule set yet for fall 2022 and spring 2023, but please stay tuned and look out for announcements. And in the meantime, you can use this firstgen@sps.cuny.edu email to share any questions, if you have suggestions for future events or things that you feel would be particularly useful for us to cover. We'd love to hear about that. I think we will be, as I said, sort of sharing out the recording and resources after the fact. So last call for, go ahead.
If I can just add a word. Speaking of resources, I'm here tonight in a kind of a speaker capacity, but for those who don't know, what I do at SPS is I work in our student counseling service, and that is a resource for you to think about any of these matters that you would like to. We talk with students all the time about matters just like this. And I said at the start that imposter syndrome is not a mental illness or a diagnosis, but one does not need a mental illness or diagnosis to make very, very good use of mental health support and psychological services and therapy. And if that's something that you have interest in, I'm putting counseling services info here in the chat right now, website and our email address. Just be in touch with us if you feel like you want to talk any of this through in an individual way.
That's great, Erin. I was just about to ask you to share your information. And Dr. Marquez-Lewis?
I just wanted to give a quick plug to the first generation student success scholarship that is now created and being offered to students who are first gen. Take a look at it. I put the link there and apply. We want students to be supported, particularly students who need financial support.
Wonderful. Well, I think we're just about at time. So I want to thank Dr. Jeanette and Dr. Marquez-Lewis for joining us tonight and for all of the wealth of information that you shared. And I want to thank all the students who attended and the events team for helping us put on this event. Please do follow up with us. We've really loved having you all here tonight, and have a wonderful evening. Thanks so much.